Unreal Engine. It's a name that has become ubiquitous with game development today. Over the past 15 years, Unreal has served as the foundation for countless franchises, from Splinter Cell to Gears of War and Mass Effect, all the way up to Street Fighter V and Tekken 7. Unreal Engine is everywhere. But where did it start, and when did it first appear on consoles? I'm John, and this is DF Retro. And today, we're going to take a look at the first appearance of Unreal Engine on consoles, starting with Unreal Tournament for the Sega Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2. But first, we need to step back to 1998. At this time, id Software's Quake engine was rocking the world. Quake 2 had hit in December 1997 and blew up the 3D accelerator market with its amazing presentation. Unreal, however, had already existed long before this point, having been in development for years prior. Visions of the game tantalized us on magazine covers everywhere, but on April 30th, 1998, the game was finally unleashed upon the world. And it was incredible. The bar was raised for 3D accelerated visuals with a blast of colored lighting, massive vistas, huge levels, parallax skyboxes, beautiful fluid textures, and some of the richest materials the world had ever seen. To put it simply, it set a new standard. But times were changing, and both id Software and Epic had something else cooking for the future. The idea, a game based entirely on deathmatch. It sounds simple enough on paper, but at the time, nobody had attempted such a thing. So when the two biggest names in first-person shooters set out to create such a game, the gaming world took notice. What made this time period so interesting, though, was the split between PC and console gaming. The games available on these different platforms could not be more different, and shooters on consoles really hadn't worked well, aside from a handful of successful N64 titles, of course. But there were developers seeking to change that, and clearly Epic Mega Games was one of them. So after finishing the PC version of Unreal Tournament, it was decided to port the game to a console. And so, Unreal Tournament began its journey to both the Sega Dreamcast and the Sony PlayStation 2. Porting the game to consoles served two purposes then. One was obviously to introduce console players to a faster kind of multiplayer game. After all, GoldenEye had already blown up on the N64, and who didn't want a piece of that? But the real reason, we believe, is the fact that Epic wanted into the console licensing space. They wanted to be a middleware provider, and porting Unreal Tournament to the PlayStation 2 was the perfect exercise. A unified codebase resulted from this project, and the engine benefited tremendously. And Dreamcast? Well, this was handled by a different developer known as Secret Level, a now defunct studio that survived for 10 years both as an independent studio and later as Sega Studios San Francisco. But while Dreamcast was actually released before the PlayStation 2, Epic's own port of Unreal Tournament would actually hit the PlayStation 2 months before the Dreamcast port. With only a few months separating the two then, how did they stack up? At this point, there was a lot of talk about how the Dreamcast could exceed the PlayStation 2 in certain areas, and games such as Unreal Tournament made for interesting comparison points. But how did they actually stack up? Well, each version actually has its own advantages, but we were surprised to learn at just how different the two actually are. First and foremost, though, it's the PS2 version that is more accurate to the original game. Several key visual features of Unreal were stripped from the Dreamcast version, but fully in place on PlayStation 2. Dynamic lighting from weapons, for instance, is completely absent on the Dreamcast. The same goes for light coronas, again, visible on PS2, absent on Dreamcast. Mirror surfaces, yep, same thing. And how about those fantastic fluid textures? Fully animated on the PS2, but dumbed down on the Dreamcast. General level lighting is also flatter on Sega's console. And some levels are even missing a skybox. But wait, look at that distant texture. Clearly it's the Dreamcast version which sports the higher resolution textures, no? Well, to find out, we decided we have to go deeper and take a look at the individual assets. So I went through and ripped out texture data from both games and came up with these results. Both games make use of 128 by 128 textures for most of the environment, with a smattering of 64 by 64 textures as well. but it's the way that these are stored and displayed that is so fascinating. On Dreamcast, with its hardware texture compression, these textures could be stored like this in full color. That same texture on PlayStation 2, however, well, it looks like this. The resolution and detail is identical, but why the difference in color? This is where the hardware differences crop up. You see, the PlayStation 2 uses 8-bit palletized textures. Textures are stored in a texture sheet at a lower color depth, where a palette texture is defined as a texel lookup before filtering is applied. This technique saves on precious memory, which in these early days of PlayStation 2 development was often difficult. But there's more to this problem. Some textures appear similar between the two when viewed in close proximity, but at a distance they're often blurrier on the PlayStation 2. Why is that? Well, this again ties into a quirk of the system. Typically, PS2 games avoided using MIP maps altogether. The method in which these textures were filtered and displayed on PS2 often gives the impression then that the textures are very low resolution, due to the approach Epic took in developing it. On the flip side, the standard Dreamcast bilinear filtering method is actually quite poor in its own right, leading to obvious banding throughout the game. Also, things like loading screens exhibit weird artifacts in the Dreamcast version in comparison to the PS2. But the real problem here is one of performance. Neither version runs particularly well, but it's the Dreamcast version that suffers the most. On Sega's console, the developer opted to leave the frame rate completely unlocked. So while you'll hit 60 frames per second in certain instances, you're just as likely to crash down into the teens when you turn around. On smaller maps, this isn't too bad. But if you play one of the larger maps, and there aren't that many here, it can wind up being very difficult to play indeed. Just look at the results here on Morpheus, where the frame rate can dip so very low while looking out into the central area. So how about PlayStation 2 then? Well, this version also struggles to run well, but Epic opted to cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second. But unfortunately, frame persistence is inconsistent here. It does feel better than Dreamcast overall, but it still isn't exactly smooth. The extra memory available on the system does at least allow for a wider selection of larger maps. Many of the best UT maps are here. Maps like Deck 16, which you're seeing here, are present and accounted for on the PlayStation 2 and offer reasonable performance. Unfortunately, the Morpheus map from Dreamcast is not in this version of the game, so we couldn't put those head to head. It also helps that you can play the game with the DualShock, which is just easier to use for a shooter like this. Of course, that isn't an issue if you hook up some accessories, as both versions natively support mouse and keyboard. Of course, the Dreamcast version also had one other advantage.
So, Tommy, have you learned anything today?
Actual online play. The Dreamcast was all about internet play back in the day, even with its modem. And while there were limitations to this, it actually did work really well. Now, it's not something you'd want to return to and mess with today necessarily, but it was a legitimate advantage at the time. Of course, both versions also support split screen. There's another neat thing as well. If you pop the PlayStation 2 disc into a PC, you can actually browse through it and uncover some rather familiar files. Yes, it's a typical Unreal Engine INI file, complete with PS2 specific settings. Cool, huh? So what was the end result of all this madness? Well, for one thing, it's clear that Unreal Engine 1 was never really a good fit for consoles. Well, at least at the time. It was not until the next revision that the engine really came alive. While it was best suited for the Xbox, Unreal Warfare or Unreal Engine 2 would actually go on to run much better on PlayStation 2 than the original Unreal Engine. But the second thing was really that, well, users would have to wait one more year for a console first-person shooter that really worked. That game would be Bungie's Halo, and that was the real game changer. It turns out that Unreal Tournament, with its fast-paced action, just wasn't actually a great console shooter. But it was all part of the learning experience. This first attempt at consoles didn't really work out that well, but it was a stepping stone towards dominance. Now, 15 years later, we can look back on these classic ports and reflect on what they ultimately went on to mean for this industry. And that is one of the reasons why we like to look back at retro games, to better understand the past in order to better appreciate the future. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much for making it to the end, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And until next Sunday, stay retro.